That morning started like any other Tuesday in our comfortable suburban home. I was in the kitchen, coffee brewing, checking the weather for what should have been our final week before the Caribbean cruise we'd planned for months. Aven was upstairs, supposedly packing, though I'd noticed she'd been distracted lately. More phone calls, more late nights at the office, more excuses. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop. The message from my wife of 12 years read, "Plans have changed. You're not going on the cruise. My ex is going instead of you." I stared at the screen for a full minute, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Pierce Eldrow, her college boyfriend who'd been sniffing around again since his divorce finalized 6 months ago. The same Pierce who'd been calling her for work advice and showing up at her office with expensive lunches. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream or punch the wall like some Hollywood hero having a breakdown. Instead, I took a screenshot, saved the message to 3 different cloud accounts, and replied with a single word. Understood. Then I got to work. My name is Rhett Vossin, and I'm a construction project manager. I've spent 15 years building things, houses, commercial buildings, entire neighborhoods. I understand foundations, structural integrity, and most importantly, I know that when something is compromised beyond repair, you don't waste time trying to fix it. You tear it down and start fresh. The cruise reservation was in my name, paid with my credit card. 1 phone call to the cruise line, and I had the booking reference, the cancellation policy, and the refund timeline. The customer service representative was sympathetic when I explained there had been a family emergency. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Vossin. We can cancel with a full refund since you're outside the penalty window. The refund will process in 5 to 7 business days." "Perfect. And can you confirm that no one else can modify this reservation without the primary cardholder present?" "That's correct, sir. Only you or someone with your written authorization." I hung up and immediately called my bank. Our joint accounts had been established when we married, but I'd maintained individual accounts for my business. The joint accounts held about $40,000 in savings and checking combined. My business accounts held considerably more. "I need to close all joint accounts effective immediately," I told the branch manager when I arrived in person an hour later. "I have documentation of infidelity and need to protect assets during divorce proceedings." The manager, a woman named Patricia who'd handled our mortgage paperwork years earlier, looked uncomfortable but professional. "We'll need both signatures unless there's a court order or evidence of financial malfeasance." I showed her the screenshot of Aven's text, along with credit card statements showing charges at expensive restaurants and hotels I'd never been to. "She's using joint funds to finance an affair. I need to protect what's mine." Patricia nodded grimly. "We can freeze the accounts pending legal review. Your individual funds remain accessible, but joint assets will be held until this is resolved through proper channels." Better than nothing. I transferred my direct deposit to my business account and requested new cards for my individual accounts. The house was the bigger challenge, but I'd prepared for this possibility without even realizing it. 3 years ago, during a refinancing, our lawyer had suggested adding a clause allowing either spouse to list the property for sale with proper notice to the other party. It was meant to protect us if one of us became incapacitated. Now it would serve a different purpose. I called our real estate agent, Janet Morrison, who'd sold us the house originally. "Rhett, how are you? Ready for that cruise?" "Change of plans, Janet. I need to list the house. Today." A pause. "Is everything all right? Where's Aven?" "Aven is on the cruise with her boyfriend. I'm exercising the emergency listing clause in our ownership agreement." Another pause, longer this time. Oh, Rhett, I'm so sorry. Are you sure about this? It's a big step." "I've never been more sure of anything. The house goes on the market today at fair market value. First reasonable offer gets accepted." Janet was a professional. Within 2 hours, she'd arranged for photos, prepared the listing, and had the house live on every major real estate website. The asking price was aggressive but fair, designed to move quickly rather than maximize profit. My phone started ringing around noon. Aven, calling from the ship. I declined the call and immediately blocked her number on my personal phone. She tried calling my work number next. "Rhett, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Her voice was shrill with panic. "I just got a notification that our accounts are frozen. You chose Pierce over me. I'm simply adjusting our arrangements to reflect your priorities. You can't just sell our house. I live there." "You live on a cruise ship with your boyfriend, apparently. The house is in both our names, and I have legal authority to list it. The listing went live 3 hours ago." "This is insane! You're being childish!" I almost laughed. Childish would be begging you to reconsider or fighting Pierce for your attention. This is just practical. You wanted him instead of me, so now you can figure out your living situation with him. "Rhett, please, we can work this out when I get back. Don't do anything permanent." The cruise was supposed to be permanent. Our anniversary trip, remember? You made it permanent when you gave my spot to another man. I hung up and immediately changed my work voicemail to direct all calls to my assistant. Aven called 6 more times in the next hour. I didn't answer. By evening, I had 3 showings scheduled for the next day and 2 more for Thursday. The real estate market was hot, and our neighborhood was desirable. Janet called with an update around 6. "We've got serious interest already. A young couple pre-approved for the full asking price, and a cash investor offering $5,000 under but with a 10-day close. Take the cash offer. I want this done fast." "Rhett, are you sure? You could probably get full price if you wait." "Speed matters more than money right now, Janet." The paperwork was signed electronically that night. Closing was scheduled for the following Thursday, exactly 1 day before Aven's cruise ended. I spent the evening packing my personal items and important documents. Everything else, furniture, kitchen appliances, decorations, would convey with the house. I wasn't interested in fighting over material possessions. I wanted a clean break. My phone buzzed with text messages from unknown numbers. Pierce, apparently, trying to reach me through different phones. "Be reasonable, man. Aven made a mistake, but you're overreacting." I responded once. "She didn't make a mistake. She made a choice. I'm making mine. We can all sit down and talk when they get back. Work something out." "There's nothing to work out. Enjoy the cruise." I blocked those numbers too. Wednesday brought a parade of inspectors, appraisers, and paperwork. The buyers were motivated. A young professional couple relocating for work who needed to close quickly. Everything aligned perfectly. Aven managed to call from the ship's communication center Wednesday evening. "Rhett, I talked to Janet. You can't actually sell without my signature. Check your email. I sent you the electronic signature documents 2 hours ago. You can sign them from the ship's business center." "I'm not signing anything. This is our home." Then the sale falls through, and I file for divorce citing adultery and abandonment. Your choice, but either way, I'm not living in a house where you planned your affair. "It's not an affair. Pierce and I are just friends." Friends don't take romantic cruises together, Aven. Friends don't send the text messages I found on your phone. Silence. She'd forgotten about the burner phone she'd hidden in the garage, tucked behind paint cans on my workbench. I'd found it Monday night while looking for sandpaper. The message history was enlightening. "You went through my private things?" "I went through my garage and found a phone that doesn't belong to me. The messages were quite detailed about your plans with Pierce. Rhett, please, I know this looks bad, but we can fix this. I love you. You love the security I provide. You love the house I maintain and the accounts I fill. But you don't love me enough to choose me over him when it matters. That's not fair. Fair would have been you asking for a divorce before planning a romantic getaway with another man. Fair would have been honesty instead of lies. Fair would have been counseling or separation before replacement." I hung up and turned off my phone. Thursday morning, I signed the closing documents at the title company. The buyers seemed like good people, excited about their first home, respectful of the situation even though they clearly sensed drama behind the quick sale. The proceeds went into my business account. After paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, I cleared about 80,000 in equity. Not bad for a week's work. I loaded my truck with my personal belongings, tools, clothes, important papers, and a few items with sentimental value that had nothing to do with Aven. Everything else stayed with the house. The new owners got the keys at 3 in the afternoon. I got a hotel room across town and started looking at rental properties in different cities. My construction business was project-based and mobile. I could work anywhere. Aven's cruise docked Friday morning. I know because she called my work number from the port, screaming about locked-out accounts and changed locks. My assistant, following instructions, told her I was no longer available at that number and suggested she contact my lawyer. I didn't have a lawyer yet, but I figured I'd need one soon. By Friday evening, I was 300 miles away in a furnished apartment I'd rented month to month. I'd transferred my business registration, updated my address with clients, and started the process of establishing residency in a new state. My phone had 47 missed calls from various numbers. I deleted them all without listening. Saturday morning, I got a single text from Janet. House transfer complete. New owners are lovely. Hope you find peace, Rhett. I replied, Thanks for everything, Janet. Take care. Then I drove to the nearest electronics store and bought a new phone with a new number. The old phone went in a drawer, powered off. Aven had chosen Pierce over me for a romantic cruise. I'd chosen myself over both of them for everything else. The cruise was over. The house was gone. The accounts were closed. I'd removed myself and everything I'd paid for, completely. 3 weeks into my new life, I was settling into a routine. The apartment was temporary but comfortable, and I'd already landed 2 construction projects in my new city. The work kept my hands busy and my mind focused on problems with clear solutions. My old phone sat in the drawer, powered off and forgotten, until curiosity finally got the better of me. I turned it on to find over 200 missed calls and countless text messages spanning 3 weeks of escalating panic. The progression was fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Week 1 had been anger. You can't just disappear, and this is kidnapping our assets, and Pierce's lawyer says what you did was illegal. Week 2 shifted to bargaining. I ended things with Pierce, and we can start over somewhere new, and I'll do anything to fix this. Week 3 was pure desperation. I'm staying in a motel, and my credit cards are maxed, and please just call me back. The most recent message from yesterday. I know you're reading these. I have nothing left. Are you happy now? I wasn't happy, exactly, but I was satisfied. There's a difference between emotional fulfillment and the calm that comes from solving a problem efficiently. I scrolled through messages from other numbers, Pierce trying to negotiate, Sammy, Aven's best friend, calling me selfish, even Aven's mother demanding I fix this mess. One message caught my attention. From Pierce, sent just 2 days ago. Aven's living in her car. Whatever point you were trying to make, you made it. This has gone far enough. I almost felt something like sympathy. Almost. Instead, I powered the phone back off and returned it to the drawer. Their crisis wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd given Aven 12 years of marriage, financial security, and emotional support. She'd given me a text message choosing another man over me. The math was simple. My new life was taking shape nicely. The apartment complex had a gym, a pool, and neighbors who didn't know my history. I'd joined a local contractors association and was building professional relationships. Nobody here knew about Aven or Pierce or the house I'd sold out from under my cheating wife. But isolation, even self-imposed, has its limits. I started frequenting a bar called Murphy's, a blue-collar place where construction workers and mechanics gathered after shifts. The bartender, Kelly, was friendly without being intrusive, and the atmosphere was comfortable. It was at Murphy's that I met Tom Bradley, a mechanic who'd recently gone through his own divorce. "Let me guess," Tom said one evening, noticing my expression as I stared into my beer. "Woman trouble." "Woman solution, actually. I solved my woman trouble pretty definitively." Tom laughed. "Yeah? How'd you manage that? I found myself telling the story, the text message, the cruise cancellation, the house sale. Tom listened with the appreciation of someone who understood betrayal. You sold the house while she was on a cruise with another guy? That's beautiful, man. Absolutely beautiful. It seemed like the most direct approach. Most guys would have just yelled or begged or tried to fight the other man. You went straight for the foundation. Respect. Tom introduced me to his circle. Guys who'd been through divorces, custody battles, financial disasters. Men who understood that sometimes the only winning move is to walk away completely. It was through Tom that I learned about Pierce Eldrow's reputation. Apparently, Pierce was known in certain circles as a serial affair partner, a wealthy man who enjoyed pursuing married women, particularly those with comfortable lifestyles he could temporarily share. He's got a pattern, explained Mike, a plumber who'd worked on Pierce's downtown condo. Targets wives who are bored or feeling neglected, wines and dines them, then moves on once the divorce gets messy. Your wife wasn't his first, and she won't be his last. This information should have made me angry, but instead it brought clarity. Aven hadn't been seduced by true love or overcome by irresistible passion. She'd been targeted by a predator who specialized in her exact vulnerability. It didn't excuse her choices, but it explained them. What happened to the other wives? I asked. Different outcomes, Mike said. One got taken to the cleaners in divorce court while Pierce disappeared. Another one's husband fought for her, and she ended up back home but broke. Pierce always comes out clean. He's got lawyers and money and no emotional investment. And now he's stuck with Aven because I removed myself instead of fighting. Tom grinned. Exactly. He probably expected you to make a scene, maybe get violent, definitely make it easy for him to play the victim while she ran to him for protection. Instead, you left him holding the bag. The mental image was satisfying. Pierce had pursued a married woman expecting the usual drama-filled triangle. Instead, he'd ended up solely responsible for a woman who'd lost her home, her financial security, and her support system. I wondered how that was working out for him. My curiosity was answered the next week when I made a decision that was probably unwise but irresistible. I drove back to my old city, not to confront anyone or create drama, but to observe. I wanted to see the aftermath of my choices. The house looked good. The new owners had already planted flowers and installed a new mailbox. It looked like a home where people were happy, which was more than it had been in its final months with Aven and me. I drove past Pierce's condo building and saw Aven's car in the visitor parking. The same car I'd helped her pick out 2 years ago, now looking unwashed and showing signs of wear. She was still in the city, apparently still with Pierce. That evening I went to Murphy's, not the one in my new city, but the original Murphy's where Aven and I had occasionally gone for dinner. I wanted to hear the local perspective on the story that had probably become neighborhood gossip. The bartender, Rick, recognized me immediately. Rhett, man, we heard what happened. That was some serious scorched earth stuff. Word travels fast. Your wife's been in here a couple times, actually. Looking for sympathy, I think. Didn't find much. Oh? Rick leaned closer, lowering his voice. Look, I don't usually comment on customers' personal lives, but she was in here last week, crying about how you destroyed her life and stole everything. When people asked for details, the story that came out was, well, let's just say public opinion wasn't on her side. What kind of details? That she texted you from a cruise ship to tell you she was replacing you with her ex-boyfriend, then came home expecting you to still be there waiting. People weren't real sympathetic to that. I ordered another beer and listened as Rick continued. The general consensus was that you handled it like a businessman. Clean, legal, no drama. Folks respected that. And Pierce? Nobody knows Pierce, but nobody likes him either. Rich guy who swoops in on other men's wives. That doesn't play well in a neighborhood like this. I left Murphy's with a clearer picture of how my story was being received. I'd worried that people might see me as cruel or vindictive, but apparently the local judgment was that I'd been pragmatic and decisive. The drive back to my new city gave me time to think. I'd successfully extracted myself from a bad situation, protected my assets, and started fresh. By any reasonable measure, I'd won. So why did I still feel like the story wasn't finished? The answer came to me as I pulled into my apartment complex. I'd solved my immediate problem, removing myself from a marriage that had become a lie, but I hadn't addressed the larger issue. Aven and Pierce had faced no real consequences for their choices beyond the inconvenience of my absence. Aven was living with Pierce, probably telling herself and anyone who'd listen that I'd been the problem all along. Pierce had gotten exactly what he wanted, another man's wife, without having to face any meaningful opposition. They'd both learned that betrayal was consequence-free as long as the betrayed party simply walked away. That seemed like an incomplete lesson. I spent the next few days thinking about whether I wanted to let sleeping dogs lie, or if there was value in providing a more comprehensive education. The practical part of me argued for continued no contact. I was building a good life, and revenge was a luxury I didn't need. But the part of me that had spent 15 years in construction, building things meant to last, understood that some foundations needed to be not just abandoned, but actively demolished to prevent future problems. Pierce Eldrow was a foundation that needed demolishing. The question was how to do it cleanly, legally, and definitively. I've always been a planner. In construction, you don't break ground until you've studied the site, analyzed the soil, checked the surveys, and pulled all the permits. Rushing leads to problems, and problems cost money. Revenge, I decided, should follow the same principles. I started with public records. Pierce Eldrow owned a downtown condo, drove a leased BMW, and ran a consulting business that seemed deliberately vague about what it actually consulted on. His divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, with his ex-wife Jennifer receiving a substantial settlement and custody of their 2 kids. Jennifer Eldrow was interesting. According to social media, she'd moved 3 states away and was rebuilding her life as a real estate agent. Her posts suggested she was doing well. New house, new career, kids thriving in their new schools. I sent her a careful message through LinkedIn, identifying myself as someone who'd been affected by her ex-husband's behavior and wondering if she'd be willing to share any insights about his patterns. Her response came within hours. I'd be happy to talk. Pierce has a very specific playbook, and I wish someone had warned me about it years ago. Are you the husband who sold the house while she was on the cruise? That story made my day. We arranged a phone call for the following evening. Jennifer Eldrow turned out to be a sharp, articulate woman who'd spent 5 years married to Pierce and another 2 fighting him in divorce court. Pierce targets wives who are financially comfortable but emotionally neglected, she explained. He's got a radar for women who feel taken for granted in their marriages. The approach is always the same. He positions himself as the sophisticated alternative to their boring husbands. How does it usually play out? He love bombs them for a few months, convinces them to leave their husbands, then loses interest once the excitement of the chase is over. The women end up divorced, often financially damaged, while Pierce moves on to the next target. What made your situation different? Jennifer laughed bitterly. I was the wife, not the target. I had to watch him systematically destroy our marriage while pursuing other women. When I finally filed for divorce, he tried to claim I was the unfaithful one. How many women were there? That I knew about? 4 during our marriage? That I suspected? Probably twice that. Pierce keeps detailed records of his conquests, photos, messages, even recordings. He thinks it's amusing. This was useful information. Records that might be embarrassing if they became public. Extremely embarrassing, especially for the women involved, most of whom thought they were his only affair partner. And these records still exist? As far as I know, Pierce is obsessive about documentation. He keeps everything on encrypted drives and cloud accounts. It's like a trophy collection for him. We talked for another hour. Jennifer gave me insights into Pierce's psychology, his methods, and most importantly, his weaknesses. He was arrogant, careless with security, and had a pattern of underestimating the people he'd wronged. "What's your plan?" Jennifer asked as our conversation wound down. "I'm not sure yet, but I think Pierce has been operating without consequences for too long. Whatever you're considering, be careful. Pierce has money and lawyers, and he's not above playing dirty when he feels threatened. Thanks for the warning. And Jennifer, I'm glad you got out." "Me too. And Rhett, I hope you destroy him." The next phase of my research focused on Pierce's current situation. I drove back to the old city and spent a weekend observing, taking notes, and gathering information. Pierce's routine was predictable. He left his condo around 9 each morning, usually returning by 6. His BMW was always parked in the same spot. He frequented the same restaurants, the same gym, the same dry cleaner. Aven was living with him, but the dynamic was clearly strained. I watched them leave together for dinner Friday night, and their body language suggested tension. She walked slightly behind him, checking her phone constantly, while he seemed focused on everything except her. At the restaurant, I took a table across the room and observed their interaction. Pierce spent most of the meal on his own phone, while Aven sat looking uncomfortable and out of place. When she tried to engage him in conversation, he responded with minimal attention. This wasn't a man in love. This was a man who'd gotten what he wanted and was already bored with it. Saturday morning, I followed Pierce to his gym. While he worked out, I struck up a conversation with Marcus, a trainer who knew him. "Pierce? Yeah, he's been coming here for years. Good tipper, keeps to himself mostly." "Seems like a successful guy." Marcus shrugged. "He talks a big game about his business, but I've never been clear on what he actually does. Consulting, he says, but that could mean anything." "The woman he's with now, is that his wife?" "Nah, Pierce got divorced a while back. This one's new. She seems nice enough, but she always looks stressed when they come in together." "Maybe relationship troubles?" "Maybe. Or maybe she's figuring out that Pierce isn't as great as he pretends to be. Guy's got a reputation, you know?" "What kind of reputation?" Marcus looked around to make sure Pierce wasn't within earshot. "Let's just say he's had a lot of girlfriends over the years, and most of them were married when he met them." I thanked Marcus and left before Pierce finished his workout. The picture was becoming clearer. Pierce was a serial predator who'd built his entire identity around seducing married women, and Aven was just his latest trophy. But trophies, once won, lose their appeal. Pierce was already losing interest in Aven, which meant she was about to discover that the man she'd destroyed her marriage for wasn't the prize she'd thought he was. That realization would be devastating enough on its own. But I was beginning to think Pierce deserved a more comprehensive education about consequences. Sunday evening, I drove past Pierce's condo one more time and noticed something interesting. Aven's car wasn't in the parking lot, but Pierce's BMW was there alongside a red convertible I didn't recognize. I parked across the street and waited. Around 10 o'clock, a woman emerged from the building, blonde, well-dressed, clearly not Aven. She got into the red convertible and drove away. Pierce was already cheating on the woman he'd stolen from me. The irony was perfect, but it also presented an opportunity. If I could document Pierce's pattern of infidelity and make that documentation public, it would serve multiple purposes. Aven would learn the truth about the man she'd chosen over me. Pierce's reputation would be destroyed, and future potential victims would be warned. But documentation required evidence, and evidence required access. I spent the next week planning an approach that would be legal, effective, and untraceable. Pierce's arrogance was his weakness. He assumed he was smarter than everyone around him, and that his victims were too embarrassed or powerless to retaliate. He was about to learn how wrong those assumptions were. The plan I developed was simple in concept, but complex in execution. I would gather evidence of Pierce's ongoing infidelities, compile a comprehensive record of his pattern of behavior, and then distribute that information to everyone in his personal and professional network. Not for revenge. Revenge was emotional and personal. This would be a public service announcement. Pierce Eldrow had spent years destroying marriages and manipulating vulnerable women without facing any meaningful consequences. It was time for him to experience some accountability. The first step was gaining access to his communications and documentation. Jennifer had mentioned that Pierce kept detailed records of his conquests, but those records would be password protected and encrypted. Fortunately, I'd spent 15 years working with security systems, access controls, and electronic locks. Construction sites are full of valuable equipment, and protecting that equipment requires understanding how people gain unauthorized access to places they shouldn't be. Pierce's condo building had decent security, but like most residential buildings, it relied more on the appearance of security than actual protection. The parking garage was accessible through a side entrance that was supposed to require a key card but had a magnetic lock that could be bypassed with basic tools. More importantly, Pierce was creatures of habit. He left every morning at 9, returned every evening around 6, and went to the gym every Saturday morning. His schedule was so predictable that I could plan around it with confidence. The second step was gathering intelligence on his current activities. I needed to know who he was seeing, how he was communicating with them, and what evidence existed of his ongoing pattern of behavior. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. This required more direct observation, which meant taking some risks. But construction work had taught me that calculated risks were different from stupid risks, and I was confident I could gather what I needed without getting caught. The third step would be compiling and distributing the evidence in a way that maximized impact while minimizing legal exposure. Pierce could threaten lawsuits all he wanted, but truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. If I could prove that everything I revealed about Pierce was factually accurate, he'd have no legal recourse regardless of how much damage it caused to his reputation. The plan would take time, patience, and careful execution. But I'd built a successful construction business by understanding that the best projects are worth doing right, even if they take longer than you'd prefer. Pierce Eldrow was about to become my most important project. And unlike Aven, he wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late to stop. Getting into Pierce's condo building turned out to be easier than I'd expected. The parking garage's side entrance had a magnetic lock that was supposed to engage automatically, but the door frame was slightly warped, leaving a gap that prevented proper closure. A thin piece of metal slipped into the gap could disengage the magnetic connection without triggering any alarms. I'd learned this technique from a locksmith who worked on construction sites, explaining how thieves gained access to supposedly secure areas. The irony of using it against Pierce wasn't lost on me. My first reconnaissance mission was simple: map the building's layout and identify Pierce's unit from the parking garage. His BMW was always in the same spot, and the elevator access showed which floors required key card activation. Pierce's unit was on the 7th floor, accessible through a hallway that had security cameras but no motion sensors. The cameras were the old-fashioned kind that recorded continuously rather than streaming live to a monitoring station. Unless someone reviewed the footage specifically looking for suspicious activity, my presence would go unnoticed. I spent 3 evenings studying Pierce's routine from inside the building. He was predictably punctual, leaving at 9 sharp each morning, returning between 6 and 6:30 each evening. On Tuesday and Thursday, he left again around 8, presumably for dates with women who weren't Aven. Aven herself was a wild card. Sometimes she was with Pierce, sometimes she wasn't. When she was absent, her car wasn't in the parking garage, suggesting she had somewhere else to go. I wondered if she was job hunting, apartment hunting, or simply trying to escape the suffocating reality of her situation. Wednesday evening provided the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Pierce left at 8 for one of his regular outings, but this time, Aven didn't go with him. Instead, she left separately around 8:30, driving in the opposite direction. I waited until 9:30 to ensure they were both gone, then made my way to the 7th floor. Pierce's front door had a standard deadbolt and a chain lock, decent security for keeping out casual intruders, but nothing that would stop someone with proper tools and knowledge. I'd brought a bump key set, a skill I'd learned from a security consultant who'd worked on several of my construction projects. The deadbolt yielded after about 30 seconds of careful manipulation. The chain lock wasn't engaged, confirming that Pierce didn't expect to be gone long. Pierce's condo was exactly what I'd expected. Expensive furniture, modern electronics, and a general atmosphere of sterile wealth. Everything was clean, organized, and impersonal. It looked like a showroom rather than a home. I started with his home office, a spare bedroom converted into a workspace with a large desk, multiple monitors, and a high-end computer system. This was where Jennifer had said Pierce kept his trophy collection of conquest documentation. The computer was password protected, but Pierce had made the classic mistake of writing his passwords on sticky notes hidden under his keyboard. Apparently, his arrogance extended to assuming no one would ever gain physical access to his equipment. The password gave me access to everything: email accounts, cloud storage, social media, and most importantly, a folder labeled Personal Projects that contained exactly what Jennifer had described. Pierce kept detailed records of every affair, organized by woman's name and including photos, message screenshots, audio recordings, and even written summaries of his strategy for each seduction. The collection went back 5 years and included dozens of women, most of whom appeared to have been married when Pierce targeted them. Aven's folder was one of the most recent, and reading through Pierce's clinical notes about manipulating her emotions made me feel something I hadn't expected: pity for my ex-wife. Pierce had identified Aven as a target based on social media posts, suggesting marital dissatisfaction. He'd researched my work schedule, our financial situation, and even our anniversary date before making his first contact. The entire affair had been planned and executed like a military operation. His notes included observations like, subject responds well to financial displays, expensive restaurants and gifts create emotional dependency, and husband appears to be typical blue-collar type. Subject feels intellectually superior when contrasted with target's sophistication. Reading Pierce's analysis of my marriage was like getting a psychological autopsy. He'd identified weaknesses in our relationship that I hadn't even noticed and exploited them with surgical precision. But the most damaging information wasn't about Aven. It was about Pierce's current activities. While Aven was living with him and presumably believing she was his exclusive partner, Pierce was actively pursuing 3 other women. The red convertible I'd seen belonged to Michelle, a recently separated mother of 2 who thought Pierce was helping her through her divorce. The Tuesday evening absences were for Rebecca, a married real estate agent who believed Pierce was considering a major property investment. Thursday evenings were reserved for Amanda, a widow who'd met Pierce at a charity function and thought he was genuinely interested in supporting her late husband's foundation. Each woman had a detailed file including personal information Pierce had gathered through social engineering, photos taken without their knowledge, and recordings of intimate conversations made without consent. Pierce wasn't just a serial adulterer, he was a predator who treated women like hunting trophies. I spent 2 hours copying everything to encrypted drives, organizing the files by victim and cross-referencing them with Pierce's calendar and communication records. The pattern was clear, documented, and absolutely damning. More importantly, it was all true and verifiable. Pierce had created this evidence himself, which meant I couldn't be accused of fabrication or manipulation. As I prepared to leave, I heard voices in the hallway outside Pierce's door. My heart rate spiked, but the voices passed by without stopping. I waited another 5 minutes to ensure the coast was clear, then slipped out and made my way back to the parking garage. The entire operation had taken less than 3 hours, but I now had enough evidence to destroy Pierce's reputation completely. The question was how to use it most effectively. My first instinct was to simply send everything to Aven and let her deal with the revelation that the man she'd chosen over me was still cheating on her with multiple women. But that felt too small, too personal. Pierce's behavior pattern suggested he'd been doing this for years, destroying marriages and manipulating vulnerable women without any consequences. Aven was just his latest victim, and there would be others after her unless someone stopped him. I decided to take a more comprehensive approach. First, I created anonymous email accounts and began reaching out to Pierce's previous victims, the women whose files I'd found in his collection. Many of them had been divorced in the aftermath of their affairs with Pierce and might be interested to learn that they hadn't been his only target during those time periods. The responses were immediate and intense. Women who'd thought they were Pierce's great love discovered they'd been one of several concurrent affairs. Women who'd destroyed their marriages for Pierce learned that he'd documented their most intimate moments like scientific specimens. Within a week, I had a network of Pierce's former victims who were eager to share their stories and support each other in taking action against him. Second, I began documenting Pierce's current activities in real time. Using the access I'd gained to his communications, I could track his ongoing manipulation of Michelle, Rebecca, and Amanda. I started sending anonymous warnings to these women, providing them with evidence of Pierce's true nature before they could be completely drawn into his web. Michelle was the first to confront Pierce directly. I listened to their argument through his phone's microphone. He'd foolishly enabled cloud backup for voice recordings, as she accused him of lying about his relationship status and his intentions. Pierce's response was telling. "You're being paranoid and jealous. This is exactly why I don't like to get too serious too quickly." But Michelle had seen the evidence I'd provided. Screenshots of Pierce's communications with other women, photos of him with Aven, and excerpts from his own notes describing her as a temporary distraction. She ended things immediately and warned her friends about Pierce's behavior. Rebecca and Amanda received similar warnings and reached similar conclusions. Within 2 weeks, Pierce's entire network of current targets had evaporated, which left him with only Aven. The timing was perfect. Pierce's other options had disappeared just as Aven was beginning to realize that her Prince Charming wasn't as charming as advertised. Pierce was becoming irritable and distant, no longer bothering to hide his lack of interest in her company. I watched from a distance as their relationship deteriorated. Pierce stopped taking Aven to nice restaurants, stopped buying her gifts, and started spending more time away from the condo without explanation. Aven, meanwhile, was struggling with the reality of her situation. She had no job, no home, no financial resources, and no support system. Her friends had distanced themselves after learning about the affair. Her family was disappointed in her choices, and her only option was dependence on a man who was clearly losing interest in her. The final phase of my plan was the most satisfying. I arranged for Aven to discover Pierce's trophy collection herself. Using Pierce's own computer access, I created a folder on his desktop labeled Aven Personal and filled it with all the documentation he'd gathered about her, along with similar files for several other women. Then, I sent Aven an anonymous message suggesting she check Pierce's computer while he was at the gym. Saturday morning, while Pierce was at his usual workout, Aven found the files. I wasn't there to witness her reaction directly, but the aftermath was clear enough. When Pierce returned from the gym, he found his belongings scattered across the parking lot and Aven waiting by his car with a baseball bat. The confrontation was loud enough that several neighbors called building security. By the time Pierce convinced Aven to put down the bat, and security convinced them to take their argument inside, half the building knew that Pierce was a cheating manipulator, and Aven was the latest in a long line of women he'd used and discarded. That evening, Aven's car disappeared from the parking garage for the last time. I never found out where she went, and I didn't try to. My business with Aven had been concluded when I sold the house and left the city. She'd made her choice, faced the consequences, and learn some hard truths about the man she'd chosen over me. But my business with Pierce was just getting started. His network of victims was gone, his reputation in the building was destroyed, and his confidence was shaken. But he still had his money, his condo, and his freedom to start over with new victims. That seemed incomplete. Pierce Eldrow had spent years destroying marriages and manipulating women without facing any real consequences. He'd treated other people's lives like games and kept trophies of his conquests like a serial predator. It was time for him to learn what consequences actually felt like. And I was just the person to teach him. Pierce's world was crumbling, but he didn't understand why. From his perspective, he'd simply had a string of bad luck with women who'd turned out to be crazy or paranoid. He had no idea that someone was systematically dismantling his life. I maintained surveillance on Pierce for another week, watching as he tried to rebuild his network of targets. He'd updated his dating profiles, started frequenting new bars and restaurants, and even joined a hiking club to meet outdoorsy women. But Pierce's reputation was spreading faster than he could run from it. The women he'd victimized were talking to their friends, posting warnings on social media, and sharing his photos in local women's groups with warnings about his predatory behavior. Every time Pierce thought he'd found a new target, she'd either already heard about him or would receive a warning before their first date progressed very far. I decided it was time to escalate from passive observation to active intervention. Pierce's consulting business was as vague and questionable as I'd suspected. After reviewing his financial records and client communications, I discovered that Eldrow Consulting was essentially a sophisticated scam targeting small businesses. Pierce would approach struggling companies, promise to improve their efficiency and profitability through strategic restructuring, and then charge enormous fees for advice that was either obvious or actively harmful. By the time his clients realized they'd been scammed, Pierce had moved on to new victims. His current target was a family-owned restaurant chain that was struggling with debt and considering bankruptcy. Pierce had convinced them that he could turn their business around for a fee of $50,000 plus 20% of increased profits. The restaurant owners, Maria and Giuseppe Romano, were second-generation immigrants who'd built their business through hard work and community support. They were exactly the kind of honest, hard-working people that Pierce specialized in exploiting. I decided to intervene. Using an anonymous email account, I contacted Maria Romano and provided her with documentation of Pierce's business practices, including testimonials from his previous victims and evidence of similar scams he'd run on other family businesses. The evidence was comprehensive: contracts that promised impossible results, testimonials from business owners who'd lost everything after hiring Pierce, and financial records showing how Pierce structured his fees to maximize his profit while minimizing his accountability. Maria's response was immediate and furious. She forwarded my email to her lawyer, her accountant, and the Better Business Bureau. Within days, Pierce was facing multiple complaints and potential legal action. More importantly, word spread through the local business community that Pierce Eldrow was a con artist who targeted struggling companies. His reputation in professional circles was destroyed almost overnight. But I wasn't finished. Pierce's condo was his pride and joy, a symbol of his success and sophistication. He'd bought it during his divorce, using money he'd hidden from his ex-wife, and considered it proof of his superior lifestyle. I decided to make that condo a liability instead of an asset. The building's homeowners association was run by a board of residents who took their responsibilities seriously. They met monthly to discuss building maintenance, rule enforcement, and community standards. I attended the next meeting as a prospective buyer interested in purchasing a unit in the building. During the public comment period, I expressed concerns about recent disturbances I'd witnessed during my visits to view apartments. "I've noticed some domestic disputes in the parking garage," I told the board. "Loud arguments, property damage, that sort of thing. It makes me worried about the kind of community atmosphere here." Board members exchanged glances. They'd clearly heard about Pierce's confrontation with Aven. "Are you referring to a specific incident?" asked the board president. "Well, I saw a woman with a baseball bat threatening to damage cars, and I've heard from other prospective buyers that there have been multiple disturbances involving the same unit." I provided the board with Pierce's unit number and suggested they might want to review building security footage to assess whether any lease violations had occurred. The board took my concerns seriously. Within a week, Pierce received a formal warning about disruptive behavior and violations of community standards. The warning went into his file and would be disclosed to future buyers if he tried to sell. More importantly, the board began paying closer attention to Pierce's activities. When he started bringing new dates to the building, security guards were instructed to monitor for any signs of disturbance. Pierce's home was no longer his sanctuary. It was a place where he was watched, judged, and documented. But the most satisfying intervention was yet to come. Pierce's ex-wife, Jennifer, had mentioned that he owed substantial back alimony and child support, payments he'd been avoiding through creative accounting and asset hiding. The divorce court had ordered him to pay, but Pierce had been successful in making himself appear less wealthy than he actually was. I provided Jennifer with Pierce's real financial records, including bank statements, investment accounts, and business income that he'd failed to disclose during divorce proceedings. The information showed that Pierce had been hiding significant assets while claiming poverty to avoid support payments. He'd been living a luxury lifestyle while his ex-wife struggled to support their children on the minimal payments he'd been court-ordered to provide. Jennifer took the evidence to her divorce attorney, who immediately filed motions for contempt of court, asset recovery, and increased support payments. Pierce was suddenly facing the prospect of paying not only current support, but also years of back payments, plus interest and penalties. The court froze Pierce's assets pending a hearing on his hidden wealth. His bank accounts were locked, his investment portfolios were seized, and his condo was placed under a lien to secure payment of his obligations. Within a month, Pierce went from living a comfortable lifestyle funded by scamming small businesses and avoiding family responsibilities to facing financial ruin and potential jail time for contempt of court. But I saved the best for last. Pierce's trophy collection of conquest documentation wasn't just morally reprehensible, much of it was legally questionable. Recording intimate conversations without consent, taking photos without permission, and keeping detailed personal information about his targets crossed several legal boundaries. I compiled a comprehensive report documenting Pierce's activities and submitted it to the district attorney's office as evidence of potential stalking, harassment, and privacy violations. The report included documentation of Pierce's systematic targeting of married women, evidence of non-consensual recording and photography, proof of identity theft and financial manipulation, testimonials from multiple victims describing emotional and financial harm. The DA's office took the matter seriously. Pierce was contacted for questioning about his activities, and several of his victims were interviewed as potential witnesses in a criminal case. While the investigation proceeded, word leaked to local media about the serial seducer who'd been targeting married women and keeping detailed records of his conquests. The story was irresistible to reporters, a wealthy con artist who specialized in destroying marriages while documenting his victims like hunting trophies. Pierce's photo appeared in newspapers and on local news broadcasts as women came forward to share their stories. Pierce's reputation wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. His business clients canceled their contracts, his condo board started eviction proceedings, his ex-wife's lawyers were seizing his assets, and the district attorney was building a criminal case against him. More importantly, every woman in the city now knew exactly who Pierce Eldrow was and what he represented. He would never be able to target another victim without her knowing his history. The final piece of my plan was the most personal. I arranged for Pierce to receive a package containing printed copies of every file he'd kept on his victims, along with a note. Your trophy collection has been shared with law enforcement, your victims, and the media. Your hunting days are over. The package was delivered to his condo on a Tuesday morning. Pierce opened it in the lobby, surrounded by neighbors who'd already heard the news reports about his activities. According to building security, who were now monitoring Pierce closely, he stood in the lobby reading through the files with a growing expression of horror as he realized the scope of what had been exposed. Then he looked directly at the security camera and said, "Rhett Vossin, you magnificent bastard." It was the first time Pierce had spoken my name since this all began, and hearing it confirmed what I'd suspected. He'd finally figured out who was responsible for his downfall. But understanding who was destroying him didn't give Pierce any power to stop it. By the time he realized I was behind his problems, every aspect of his life had already been systematically dismantled. His business was ruined, his assets were frozen, his reputation was destroyed, and his freedom was in jeopardy. Pierce Eldrow had spent years treating other people's lives like games, keeping score of his conquests and moving on to new targets without consequences. Now he was learning what it felt like to be the target instead of the hunter. And unlike his victims, Pierce had no one to blame but himself. The house was sold, the accounts were closed, and the reckoning was complete. Pierce tried to fight back, of course. Men like him always do when they finally face consequences for their actions. But Pierce had built his entire life on deception and manipulation, which meant he had no foundation of truth or legitimacy to fall back on when the lies collapsed. His first move was predictable. He hired a lawyer and threatened to sue me for harassment, defamation, and invasion of privacy. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, reviewed Pierce's case and quickly realized that her client had no viable legal options. Everything I'd exposed about Pierce was true and documented by his own records. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims, and Pierce had created all the evidence himself. He couldn't claim invasion of privacy for information he'd voluntarily recorded and stored. More problematically for Pierce, his threat to sue me required him to admit that he was the person who'd created the trophy collection of victim documentation. Making that admission in a legal filing would provide prosecutors with additional evidence for their criminal case. Patricia Chen advised Pierce to focus on damage control rather than retaliation, but Pierce's ego wouldn't allow him to accept defeat gracefully. His second attempt at fighting back was even more desperate. He tried to contact Aven and convince her to help him prove that I was obsessed and dangerous. Pierce apparently believed that if he could portray me as an unhinged ex-husband seeking revenge, it would somehow excuse his own behavior and discredit the evidence against him. But Aven had read Pierce's files about her. She'd seen his clinical notes describing how he'd manipulated her emotions, his assessments of her weaknesses, and his plans for discarding her once she'd served her purpose. Aven knew exactly what Pierce was and what he'd done to her. When Pierce called her asking for help, Aven's response was reportedly brief and profane. Then she hung up and immediately called the prosecutor's office to volunteer as a witness against him. Pierce's third and final attempt at retaliation was the most satisfying. He tried to approach me directly. I was having dinner at Murphy's in my new city when Pierce walked in. He'd somehow tracked me down, probably through private investigators or public records searches. He looked terrible, unshaven, wearing wrinkled clothes, with the desperate expression of a man whose world had collapsed. Pierce spotted me at the bar and walked over with what I'm sure he thought was confident swagger, but looked more like barely controlled panic. "Rhett Vossin," he said, sliding onto the stool next to me. "We need to talk." "No, we don't," I replied without looking at him. "You need to leave. You've destroyed my life over a woman who isn't worth either of our time. This has gone far enough." I turned to face Pierce for the first time since this all began. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. He'd lost weight, his hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "I didn't destroy your life, Pierce. I just made your choices public. Everything that's happening to you is the natural consequence of your own actions." Aven made her choice. She chose me over you. Why can't you accept that and move on? I almost laughed. You think this is about Aven? Pierce, I got over Aven the day I sold the house. This is about you. What did I ever do to you? You made the mistake of thinking I was just another blue-collar husband who'd roll over when you stole his wife. You underestimated me, and now you're paying for that mistake. Pierce's facade of confidence finally cracked. What do you want? Money. I can pay you to make this stop. I don't want anything from you, Pierce. I want you to understand that actions have consequences, and that the women you've been treating like hunting trophies are real people with real lives that you've damaged. Those women made their own choices. You manipulated vulnerable people using techniques you'd researched and practiced. You documented their most intimate moments without consent. You destroyed marriages and families for your own entertainment. Pierce was sweating now, his desperation becoming more obvious. Okay, fine, maybe I made some mistakes, but you can't just destroy someone's entire life? Watch me. I stood up to leave, but Pierce grabbed my arm. This isn't over. The bar went quiet. Murphy's was a blue-collar place where men settled their differences directly, and everyone present could sense the tension. I looked down at Pierce's hand on my arm, then back at his face. Yes, it is. You're done, Pierce. Your business is ruined, your assets are frozen, your reputation is destroyed, and you're facing criminal charges. You have nothing left to threaten me with. I pulled my arm free and walked toward the door. Pierce followed me outside, still trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. You think you're so smart, he called after me, but you lost too. Aven chose me over you, and that's something you'll have to live with forever. I stopped and turned back to face him one last time. Pierce, you're missing the point. Aven didn't choose you over me. She chose the fantasy you created over the reality she had with me. And when that fantasy collapsed, she learned the same lesson you're learning now. Choices have consequences. So what? You got revenge, and now you feel better? This isn't revenge, Pierce. Revenge would be personal and emotional. This is just problem-solving. You were a problem that needed to be solved. So I solved you. I got in my truck and drove away, leaving Pierce standing alone in the parking lot of a bar 300 miles from his ruined life. That was the last time I saw Pierce Eldrow. The criminal case against him proceeded slowly but inevitably. Multiple women testified about his pattern of manipulation and non-consensual documentation. The evidence I'd provided formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Pierce eventually pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence that included probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. He was also required to pay restitution to several of his business fraud victims. His ex-wife, Jennifer, recovered most of the hidden assets and back support payments. Their children would finally receive the financial support they were entitled to. The women Pierce had victimized found some measure of closure in seeing him held accountable for his actions. Several of them started a support group for survivors of manipulation and emotional abuse. Pierce's condo was sold to pay his legal debts and restitution obligations. He moved to a different state, presumably to start over somewhere his reputation hadn't preceded him. I never found out what happened to Aven, and I didn't try to. Our marriage had ended the morning she sent me that text message, and everything that happened afterward was just cleanup. But sometimes I wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, or if she'd simply moved on to the next man who promised her something better than what she already had. I hoped she'd learned something. Despite everything, I didn't wish her harm. I just wished she'd made better choices. As for me, I settled into my new life with a sense of completion I hadn't expected. The construction business was thriving, I'd made good friends in my new city, and I'd proven to myself that I could handle betrayal without becoming bitter or broken. The whole experience had taught me something important about myself. I was stronger than I'd realized, more capable than I'd known, and more willing to fight for what mattered than I'd ever imagined. Pierce had thought he was dealing with a typical blue-collar husband who'd accept defeat gracefully. Instead, he'd encountered someone who understood that some problems require comprehensive solutions. I'd solved the problem of Pierce Eldrow the same way I approached construction projects, systematically, thoroughly, and with attention to long-term stability. The foundation was solid, the structure was sound, and the project was complete. 6 months after my encounter with Pierce at Murphy's, I received an unexpected message through LinkedIn. It was from Jennifer Eldrow, Pierce's ex-wife. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. Pierce is finally paying the support he owes, and my kids are getting the financial stability they deserve. More importantly, he can't hurt any more women the way he hurt us. You gave a lot of people their lives back." I replied simply, "I'm glad it helped. Take care of yourself and your kids." That was the real measure of success. Not that Pierce had been punished, but that his victims had been helped. The women he'd manipulated had found justice, his ex-wife had recovered her financial security, and future potential targets had been warned about his true nature. The house was sold, the accounts were closed, and the reckoning was complete. But more than that, the problem was solved. Pierce Eldrow would never again be able to destroy marriages and manipulate women without consequences. His hunting days were over, his victims had found their voices, and the community was protected from his predatory behavior. That evening, I went to Murphy's, my Murphy's, in my new city, and had a beer with Tom and the other guys who'd become my friends. We talked about work, sports, and the usual things men discuss when they're comfortable with each other. Nobody asked about my past, and I didn't volunteer any details about the life I'd left behind. Some stories are better left untold, and some problems are better solved quietly. The cruise had been canceled, the house was gone, and the reckoning was complete. I was exactly where I needed to be.